Hi, we're here with Ariel Dan. He's CEO of Cloudify, and we're going to talk about some of the cloud trends for 2021. Hi, Ariel. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Larry. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I guess at a high level, I know Cloudify does, multi-cloud management, some orchestration. I guess walk me through a high level kind of what you guys do.
Well, we do exactly that, right? We automate environments. That would be the simplest way of putting it. But what we see is that the challenge that enterprise has today is not necessarily the automation. We actually think that there are too many automation tools out there, and C-levels, technology C-levels, CIOs, CTOs are actually having to figure out a way to manage those automation tools. So what we came out with and what we see actually great success with is what we call an orchestrator of orchestrators, right? Instead of coming in there and having businesses basically replace everything they've invested in and do it quote unquote right with our tool, we say let's do it the other way around. Let's integrate the work that you've already done and the tools that you've already invested in into Cloudify, and then we'll do that automation from that starting point.
Okay. What do you see in terms of hybrid cloud meets multi-cloud? Like how do those two play together?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that COVID-19 is actually very significant in the trends that we see in the market and our customers are telling us about. What we saw during 2020, which was a unique year in any sense, is that enterprises had actually doubled down on the private cloud for their core business as the starting point, right? They all have a multi-cloud strategy. They all want to push some of their stack into multi-cloud and then some, right? I mean, from multi-cloud into Kubernetes, serverless, etc. But the base, the core is private cloud, and that's not only that it's not going away, we're now seeing the trend of basically reinvesting in private cloud, making sure that their private stack and their technology stack can actually be automated and feel like a public cloud.
So do you think these are two separate categories, or do you think they kind of blend together?
In a perfect world, those would be blended together. But when you kind of dissect the problem from a tooling and technology perspective, you see very different tools to solve the problems, right? Even in Kubernetes, you have the tools for the private stack, right? The OpenShifts of the world. And then you have each cloud vendor has its own Kubernetes flavor, right? So from a tooling and technology perspective, I think that there is a difference. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to bridge that mess, if you may, of multiple tools across multiple clouds. Because at the end of the day, you're absolutely correct. It should be a single end-to-end service that an enterprise provide either to their own internal users or to their customers.
Do you think it's going to be a case of, I guess, who's going to manage all this? We'll exclude Cloudify because you obviously want to pitch yourself. But do you think it'll be a vendor that'll provide the one pane of glass thing? Do you think it'll be from the more traditional space with the private cloud side, or will we entrust like Google Cloud Platform or AWS or Azure to sort of manage on-premise as well as public infrastructure?
Yeah. So again, I think that my philosophy would be open source as the one I would say guiding principle. Whether the technology is Cloudify or something else, it would be very hard to trust a vendor that would bring his technology stack and, ensure vendor neutrality at the same time, right? So I think that regardless of the solution, enterprises will be looking for an open source solution, which will try to take that, vendor agnostic approach and actually behave nicely and work with everyone, whether it's Google Cloud, whether it's obviously Kubernetes across the stack, Amazon Web Services, or VMware.
So do you see that being an advantage for like Red Hat, or do you see like a new wave of open source vendors that have come up?
there has to be a new wave of open source vendors because I think there's room for a lot of disruption in the space of automation, right? When we look at Red Hat, we think that they have a lot of the tools, but I think that there's room for other, I would say, more disruptive solutions that will take the next step forward in terms of the way the actual automation engine works, the end-to-end orchestration across networking, infrastructure, application, private and public clouds. So Red Hat is a very capable company. Of course, IBM now, but I think that they have to do some innovation in order to get to what we call the latest trend of orchestration.
So you think the competitive advantage for cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid, all that stuff is going to be the basically automation, basically how much of this stuff and how much of this management you can automate?
Well, I think you can automate a lot of this. I think that the challenge is not automating the full stack as much as where do we as an enterprise start, right? And what we're pitching from, again, not from a vendor perspective, but from a philosophy perspective, is start with ensuring that your private cloud behaves as a public cloud and then take it from there. I think that the most critical element for enterprises today is how do they leverage the investment that they've made today in order to get to the cloud efficiently. It can't be a lift and shift approach. We've already seen that, right? So I think that the balance that we're trying to pitch for is start with automating everything that you have in place on premise, and then leverage existing and new technologies as they grow further.
Do you think we can automate and orchestrate, the various public, because the dream is that you have multiple public cloud providers and you have this automation layer that can sort of manage for cost and swap back and forth between AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud just based on, economics. As we know, the future, as we know that isn't exactly playing out per se. What do you think has to happen for that to play out?
Okay, so let me tell you what we do, right? So when, out of the box with Cloudify, you get the plugins for Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Azure, VMware, and a bunch of other automation tools. Because again, what we see is if you're, solely on Amazon Web Services, you have the automation tools you need as a business. If you're solely on Microsoft Azure, you'll have the same automation tools that you need. The question becomes, how do you, exactly as you said, merge between the two or have a multi-cloud strategy? And this is where Cloudify kind of comes into play. So in the immediate term, what we do today is we provide that orchestration layer across all those clouds. And we allow the businesses to basically choose the cloud to work with and automate specific cloud layers down the road. What we want to do in the actually near future is to automate the automation processes. And that, I think, is the holy grail of automation, right? We would like to be able to provide, think of a discovery feature, right? So I'm an enterprise, I click discover, I get my VMware infrastructure layout or everything that I asked for that stack to be discovered at. And then with a click of a button, I can transform that discovery into the similar services in Amazon Web Services. So, we're not there yet, but this is the vision that we'd like to bring to the market because it's getting too complicated. It's really hard to configure all of this.
Well, yeah, and I think that configuration issue is part of the reason why you see companies basically giving up leverage to be all in on one cloud provider or the other, right? Like you kind of see them, they gravitate to that one preferred vendor. And I've always looked at this in enterprise software and thought it was a little wacky. Just because you give up all your leverage, like you need another supplier in there no matter what. But I see companies do it repeatedly. And I just wonder if it's, an issue, a tech issue or a financial leverage issue or discounts. But, business-wise, I'm not sure it makes sense. So do you think that's a tech problem?
It's a good question. I think it's both. But from a technology perspective, we know that, certain cloud vendors are good at certain offerings, right? Google Cloud is pretty good at providing, big data services, right? Amazon Web Services is the leader in infrastructure automation and infrastructure as a service. Microsoft Azure has a lot of enterprise leverage because that's what they've been doing for all their professional careers, right? So when I'm looking at the different clouds and I see the kind of the specific offerings that they will bring to market, my hunch is that businesses would want to consume best of breed. They would want to take big data services or data analytics from Google Cloud while using Amazon Web Services for their infrastructure as a service, right? So that would be the reality, right? And as an enterprise, we need to, purchase that insurance policy, if you may, that will allow us to combine those, innovations or the best of breed of those clouds.
Right. Okay. Any other trends to think about in the cloud for 2021?
Yeah, many. I mean, I think that Kubernetes is probably one of the biggest enablers that multi-cloud has seen, right? I mean, as I've mentioned before, you see Kubernetes offerings for private and any cloud offering that is out there. One of the trends that we're seeing already is the inability of enterprises to deal with multi-Kubernetes clusters, right? It's getting out of control. So that's one trend you need to pay attention to, and you need to figure out how to, control that, quote unquote, good mess that you have in place. So that's one trend. The second trend, again, said it before, but I think it's worth repeating. Private cloud is not going anywhere. In fact, we see the public cloud vendors basically going to the private cloud, which hasn't happened before. So that would be a very interesting trend to follow. And the third one is edge computing, in the sense of, IoT and multi-Kubernetes clusters is becoming yet another example of, multi-cloud, right? If you think about edge sites, each edge, in principle represents a cloud, right? So you have to manage those IoT edge sites or whatever your edge use case is in a certain way. So this will become a very interesting perspective in the way that cloud is growing and the ability that businesses will have to manage and orchestrate their capacity.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.